Donald Trump's press conference with CNN's Kaitlancollins turned into a disaster moments ago, with the former president losing his ability to speak clearly. What was supposed to be a routine briefing quickly became chaotic as Trump stumbled over his words, growing increasingly disoriented. At times, he appeared unable to form coherent thoughts, with his speech becoming erratic and disconnected. His frustration was palpable, and his responses lacked the usual self-assurance, leaving many viewers stunned by his apparent inability to regain control. The embarrassing incident raised fresh concerns about his mental fitness for leadership, overshadowing any political message he attempted to convey. Trump's public mental decline, the warning signs. Even before his tenure as president, Donald Trump's fitness for office was questioned. Many pointed to his erratic behavior, his frequent inflammatory comments, and his apparent lack of knowledge on key issues as red flags. However, the true nature of his unpreparedness came into sharper focus during his presidency. As he faced intense pressure from both domestic and international crises, it became increasingly clear that Trump lacked the necessary skills and experience to handle such weighty matters. During his time in office, Trump made headlines for his sharp comments, contentious decisions, and controversial policy. But beneath the surface, the signs of a deeper issue were becoming harder to ignore. His public appearances often featured strange behavior, rambling speeches, and inconsistent messaging. He seemed to lack the focus required to navigate the complexities of international diplomacy, economic strategy, and even basic governance. Yet, even as his mental acuity faltered, Trump continued to push forward, focusing more on self-promotion and personal gain than on fulfilling the promises he made to the American people. His presidency was characterized by dramatic tweets, controversial decisions, and a disregard for traditional political norm. This brand of leadership worked for a time, as his base rallied around him. However, as time went on, cracks in his facade began to show. The press conference, a turning point. On a day that will go down in infamy, Donald Trump stood before the press, his words slurred and disjointed. His usual bombastic bravado was absent, replaced instead by a faltering, shaky demeanor that betrayed a man struggling to maintain control. The conference itself was a moment of great significance, but it quickly descended into a display of incoherence. Trump, who has long prided himself on his ability to command a room, found himself stumbling over his words, unable to make coherent points or stay on track. In a moment that will undoubtedly be replayed countless times, Trump appeared unable to respond to basic questions about policy. When asked about tariffs and their potential impact on the economy, his response was brief and utterly devoid of substance. "There's nothing to study," he said dismissively. "It's going to go well. The United States is going to become a very, very strong economic country." While the words may have sounded confident, they were hollow. His answer lacked any real detail or thoughtfulness, as if he were simply trying to put forth a show of certainty to distract from the underlying chaos. What was more alarming, however, was the way in which Trump delivered his response. His speech was not just lacking in substance, it was lacking in coherence. The manner in which he stumbled through his words raised serious questions about his ability to engage with the world's most pressing issue, let alone lead the most powerful nation on earth. It wasn't just this one press conference that raised concerns. It was a culmination of behaviors and actions that have become increasingly erratic over the years. But this specific moment stood out as the most obvious example of Trump's unraveling. His performance sent shockwaves through those who were still holding out hope that he could reclaim some semblance of his former self. For many, this was the moment when it became impossible to ignore the reality of Trump's decline. The media's double standard. While Trump's behavior at the press conference was deeply concerning, what was even more alarming was the response, or lack thereof, from the mainstream media. Despite the glaring signs of Trump's deterioration, major news outlets largely ignored or downplayed the incident. This silence was all the more striking, given the media's incessant scrutiny of every minor misstep from other political figures, particularly President Joe Biden. Throughout Biden's time in office, the media has consistently pointed out his stumbles, gaffes, and occasional lapses in memory. Yet when Trump exhibited the same, if not worse, signs of cognitive decline, the media barely seemed to notice. Why the double standard? Why were the glaring signs of Trump's unraveling ignored? While every word from Biden was meticulously examined and critiqued, this discrepancy in coverage speaks to a deeper issue within the media landscape, one where certain figures are held to vastly different standards. Trump, despite his obvious mental and physical decline, continues to receive preferential treatment from certain outlets and supporters. Meanwhile, the same press that relentlessly dissected every aspect of Biden's presidency has remained largely silent when it comes to Trump's increasingly erratic behavior. Trump's broken promises and betrayal of the American people. Beyond his mental decline, another significant aspect of Trump's presidency and his post-presidency actions has been his failure to deliver on the promises he made to the American people. From the moment he began his campaign, Trump promised to lower costs for working families, bring back jobs, and restore American greatness. But time and time again, he failed to live up to these promises. Take, for example, the issue of grocery prices. During his campaign, Trump boldly proclaimed that on day one of his administration, grocery prices would begin to decline. Yet, as his time in office came and went, the opposite occurred. Prices for food, housing, consumer goods, and insurance only continued to rise. And now, in his post-presidential years, Trump's focus remains squarely on self-interest, with little regard for the impact of his policies on the everyday American. This failure to deliver on his promises is not just a political issue, it's a personal betrayal to the millions of people who believed in him. Trump's promises were not just about policy, they were about hope. He gave people a sense of pride and the belief that things could be different. But in the end, his presidency was nothing more than a performance designed to enrich himself and his allies. His betrayals are not just a series of broken promises. They are a profound act of dishonesty that has left many Americans feeling disillusioned and betrayed. The state visit. Signs of the beginning of the end. Before the press conference, there were already signs that Trump's mental and physical state was deteriorating. During a state visit with the Prime Minister of India, Trump struggled to maintain composure. His words faltered, his focus wavered, and his energy seemed to be sapped. His behavior during this visit was telling. Standing beside one of the world's most powerful leaders, Trump looked less like the former president of the United States and more like a man on the verge of losing control. The images from that day painted a grim picture. Trump, once known for his commanding presence and unwavering confidence, appeared lost in thought, unable to keep up with the demands of the moment. His interactions with Indian officials were awkward, and his attempts at diplomacy were lackluster at best. It was a far cry from the image of the self-assured leader he once projected. In retrospect, this state visit now stands as a crucial turning point. It marked the beginning of what has become a rapid unraveling of his mental and physical faculties. What was once a man driven by ego and ambition has now become a shell of his former self, stumbling through public events and struggling to keep up with the basic demands of his status. A bleak future. As Trump continues to deteriorate, the future looks increasingly bleak. He is no longer the formidable political force he once was, but rather a shadow of his former self, clinging to a past that is slipping further away with each passing day. His decline is not just a personal tragedy, it is a national crisis. The man who once held the highest office in the land is now unfit to lead, and yet he continues to grasp for relevance. What remains to be seen is whether America will allow this decline to continue unchecked. Will the country continue to ignore the warning signs? Or will there be a reckoning for those who continue to support a man who is no longer capable of fulfilling the duties of leadership? In the end, the question is not just about Trump's decline. It's about the future of American democracy. The stakes have never been higher, and the path forward is unclear. One thing, however, is certain. America deserves better than what Trump has offered in his twilight years. The toll of power, corruption, and unchecked ego. In the world of politics, Few things are as telling as the unraveling of a leader's personal and professional integrity. The price of power, corruption, and an unchecked ego often takes a much greater toll on the individual who holds that power than anyone else. In many ways, it's a process of self-destruction. The pursuit of control and influence can cloud one's judgment, erode moral compasses, and distort the very nature of their identity. The consequences of this process, however, extend far beyond the individual. When those at the top lose sight of what truly matters, the ripple effects often extend to the citizens they are supposed to serve. This process of degradation and disillusionment has long been an underlying current in the career of Donald Trump, a man whose ego and personal ambitions have often overshadowed his supposed commitment to the nation he led. But the toll that his actions have taken on both him and the country is undeniable. The public spectacle of power gone wrong, the reckless pursuit of vengeance, and the mounting consequences of living in the shadow of personal vendettas have played out for all to see. These are not merely political moments, they are deeply personal reckonings, ones that speak to the cost of putting blind faith in a person who was never truly prepared for the responsibility of leadership. A nation's trust and its consequences. For many years, Donald Trump captured the imaginations of millions, selling an image of strength, business acumen, and unshakable resolve. He ran on the premise of being a political outsider, promising to shake up the system and bring about monumental change. His brand of populism resonated with those disillusioned by traditional politics, offering them a leader who seemed, at the time, more in touch with their concerns. Yet, this faith in Trump's leadership was misguided from the very start. His rise to power was not due to the greatness of his character or the wisdom of his policies, but rather through his ability to tap into the frustrations and fears of those who felt overlooked and unheard. However, the consequences of entrusting such an individual with the highest office in the land soon became apparent. When the spotlight shone on Trump, it revealed not a man of principle and conviction, but one deeply concerned with his own ego and legacy. As the first few years of his presidency unfolded, it became clear that Trump's actions were not about uniting the country or fulfilling the promises he made on the campaign trail. They were about serving his own personal interests and settling scores with anyone who dared to cross him. What's even more troubling, however, is the toll that this had on the nation. Every decision Trump made seemed to be influenced by his ego, often at the expense of sound policy or the greater good. The consequences of this were felt across the nation, as citizens watched their political system become more chaotic, more divided, and more corrupt. The ideals of democracy seemed to be unraveling, and those who had placed their trust in Trump began to see the true cost of their misplaced faith. The tangled web of Trump's meltdown. A defining moment in understanding the unraveling of Trump's leadership came during a press conference with the Prime Minister of India. On the surface, the event appeared to be an opportunity for diplomatic relations between two of the world's most powerful countries to be solidified. It was supposed to be a moment of poise and professionalism, one where Trump could demonstrate his leadership on the global stage. But instead of maintaining the decorum expected of a leader, Trump veered off script and displayed a side of himself that was disjointed, erratic, and unsettling. His remarks during this press conference were a stark departure from the typical political discourse. He couldn't keep his thoughts straight, his words becoming a tangled web of confusion, anger, and contradiction. It wasn't just a speech, it was a meltdown. Watching the performance, it became apparent that this was not just a one-off incident. Instead, it was part of a larger pattern. Whenever Trump became fixated on past grievances, whenever he allowed his anger to dictate his actions, he lost control completely. In this particular moment, his inability to stay focused was not just embarrassing, it was a demonstration of his unfitness to lead. As his words became more chaotic and disconnected, it was impossible to ignore the fact that the man standing before the Prime Minister of India was not the same person many had envisioned as a competent leader. His fixation on personal grudges and past failures was no longer a mere flaw. It was a dangerous weakness. In a moment meant to highlight the future of international relations, Trump had instead shown the world how quickly a leader could unravel under the pressure of their own ego, a pattern of vengeance and unforgiveness. What makes moments like these even more disturbing is the fact that they are not isolated. Trump's obsession with vengeance and his inability to let go of past grievances have been recurring themes throughout his political career. This tendency to focus on perceived slights and settle old scores has been a driving force behind much of his decision-making. Whether in his dealings with political opponents, foreign leaders, or even members of his own administration, Trump's inability to move past past events often led to decisions based on emotional impulses rather than rational thought. This obsession with revenge is not just a personal flaw, it's a dangerous characteristic for someone in a position of power. A leader who cannot forgive or forget is one who is governed by past wounds rather than the needs of the present. This constant preoccupation with the past is ultimately what undermines any vision for a better future. And as Trump's time in office wore on, it became increasingly clear that his fixation on revenge was not just a personal issue, it was a national one. As the anger consumed him, his leadership became erratic. The very stability that the country needed during moments of crisis was lost in the wake of his bitterness and rage. Rather than being a unifier, Trump became a divider, unable to inspire confidence in the American people or the world at large. His inability to move past the past, to let go of old wounds, and to focus on the future became a constant drag on his presidency. The mental and emotional costs of leadership. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of Trump's leadership style was the toll it took on his mental and emotional well-being. The stresses of the office, combined with his personal insecurities and egotistical tendencies, seemed to amplify the negative aspects of his character. It became increasingly clear that the very traits that had once propelled him to political success, his brashness, his unpredictability, his need for constant validation, were also the ones that would ultimately lead to his downfall. Throughout his presidency, there were moments when it seemed as though Trump was losing his grip on reality. His tendency to lash out at critics, his refusal to take responsibility for failures, and his constant need for adulation pointed to a deeper psychological toll. A leader who is driven by ego, anger, and a need for vengeance is a leader who is not in control. And when such a person is entrusted with the reins of power, the consequences can be catastrophic. This is not just about politics. It's about the emotional and psychological cost of leadership. It's about understanding the toll that unchecked ego and emotional instability can have on a leader's ability to govern effectively. And when that leader is someone like Donald Trump, someone who thrives on chaos and conflict, the cost is far greater than mere political missteps. The unraveling of the American handshake. In the final days of his presidency, Trump's actions had eroded not only his personal credibility, but the global perception of the United States as a leader on the world stage. The American handshake, the symbol of trust, integrity, and cooperation, had become increasingly meaningless. Leaders around the world began to question the reliability of the United States as a partner, a shift that had lasting consequences for international diplomacy. As foreign policy took a back seat to personal grievances and domestic strife, Trump's inability to maintain stable relationships with other countries led to a loss of influence. What had once been a cornerstone of American diplomacy, the ability to form alliances and lead by example, had been tarnished. The lack of consistency in Trump's foreign policy, his unpredictability, and his disdain for long-established international norms all contributed to the weakening of America's standing in the world. And as we reflect on these events, it is impossible to ignore the fact that Trump's legacy is marked not by the success of his policies, but by the personal and national unraveling that accompanied them. His inability to separate his personal ego from his role as a leader led to a loss of respect, both at home and abroad. The future of American leadership. As we look ahead, the question remains, can America continue to function with the same sense of confidence and unity after such a tumultuous period? How much longer can we pretend that this kind of behavior, This disjointed, erratic leadership is acceptable in a nation that has long prided itself on its principles and integrity? The answer to these questions lies not just in the political future of the country, but in the personal and collective healing that must take place. The toll of power, corruption, and unchecked ego has been profound, but it's not too late to restore the ideals that once defined American leadership. It will take time, effort, and a renewed commitment to the values that have always been the foundation of the nation's strength. But until then, we can only watch and reflect on what we've learned from the leadership of a man who, ultimately, could not control the very forces that drove him to power.